My name is Natalia Shapovalova, and the book I'm presenting is Civil Society in Post-Euromaidan Ukraine. I mean, it's a collective volume. There are many authors, more than 20 authors, contributors to the book. And we as a co-editors we were interested to bring these people together. They are both Ukrainians, and some of them are also foreigners who study civil society in Ukraine. And the idea was to examine what has happened with civil society and within the civil society in Ukraine since the Euromaidan protest of 2013-2014. What we thought has changed a lot since the Euromaidan protest, it's understanding what civil society is. In 90s and early 2000, there was much understanding that civil society is something kind of Western concept built around NGOs, non-governmental organizations. They are also pro-Western or pro-European, and they adopt and pursue some liberal values, democratic values. And we noted that it's not exactly the fact in Ukraine that civil society is much more diverse. So we also wanted to show this richness and diversity of civil society in Ukraine. So there are many chapters that cover different civil society actors, some of them maybe not very usual, like churches, for example, or volunteer groups that help the army and to defend the country against a foreign enemy, or groups that help internally displaced people, and in such a way they basically substitute the state. There is also a chapter on openness of civic space. And though there is this understanding that the Euromaidan protest basically gave more freedoms to people, and they were victors in the sense that people defending their right to public assembly, freedom of expression, and so on, will also show that the state recognized civil society as a powerful actor. And in many cases, it goes against civil society because it sees civil society actors as someone dangerous that can undermine their power. And we consciously didn't provide a definition in our book of what civil society is, because we also wanted to celebrate this diversity of what it can be. And we also wanted to give our authors freedom to choose what they want to define as civil society. But basically, there are three, let's say, concepts that we use as civil society. Civil society as an actor vis-a-vis the society at large and the state. And it's something that comes in many articles when our authors examine, for example, state-civil society relationship in public policy realm, or when volunteer groups help the army or armed actors. Also, civil society is a space where people can come together and jointly present their interests, their views, and participate in public policies and public politics. And in some chapters, actually, this kind of definition of civil society comes forward. But also, and it's something that we fundamentally wanted to underline, civil society is about values. And here it's about values of civility. But what is civility is constantly renegotiated. And we show also in some chapters, for example, the author who wrote a chapter on LGBT groups, she shows how this values of what civility is and what it includes, how it has been changing even within understanding of these groups. And of course, there are many more actors that claim that civility is something else. And she shows actually this antagonism between LGBT groups, or groups that defend human rights, and then radical right groups that they defend the concept of nation, and what the nation is for them is something very different than for many liberal groups is. This is something that also comes in this book, that conflict is a very powerful factor of mobilization, why groups mobilize. And we see that even if you look at at the Euromaidan protest, people mobilized because they saw a conflict between them, the society at large, or at least groups who felt that the state was not doing right for them, and the state or the elites. And because there was this conflict between the society and the state, or the society and the elites, a part of the society mobilized. And the fact that the state tried to take even more from them, from what they mobilized for, their freedoms to choose, freedoms to develop a country in a European direction, freedom of public assembly, freedom of expression, groups mobilized even further. And then when the state responded with violence, they responded with further mobilization to protect citizens against violence of the state. And sometimes they also they used violent methods to do that. And we also saw that next, it was a very quick development of the events, but we saw that immediately when the protests were over, Russian occupation of Crimea started, then the armed conflict in eastern Ukraine. And this also was a very powerful factor of mobilization of civil society. But here I would like to underline, and there are also several authors who do that in the book, this mobilization was also, on the one hand, it was civil society mobilization. Citizens took, the more responsibility for the fate of their country in their hands when the state was very weak. So they showed this mobilization in defense of the state, of their country, of their values, because they felt that the state was very weak and couldn't protect them enough. So this mobilization was kind of in opposition to the weakness of the state. But it was also, I would call it national mobilization, kind of national revival, because many groups who protested at the Maidan in Kyiv and other places in Ukraine, they also felt that it was very much about their patriotism, even their nationalism, the Ukraine as a state and Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian values, as opposed to Russian or Soviet or post-Soviet. In that sense, this foreign aggression is also, it has been a very important factor of mobilization of civil society in Ukraine. The mobilization was very spontaneous, as you know. Of course, there were groups within the civil society who were defending this human rights and civic freedoms for many, many years. And they had this knowledge of what such protection of human rights is and how to do it. But I would say the mass mobilization during the Euromaidan protest was spontaneous. And what happened after the Euromaidan protest, this large civil society mobilization to defend the state and territorial integrity of Ukraine was also to a large extent spontaneous. And there are several authors in the book who show this nature of this mobilization, and they show that these groups who appeared, these volunteer groups, for example, who helped the army or who helped the displaced people, they were new groups. There were many new people coming to what is called civil society sector in Ukraine. So, but many of them also used the knowledge of all the groups, of all the NGOs. So it was a mix of many new people who kind of came and became civic activists, and also all the organizations that had some knowledge of how to do certain things. But I would say what was very unique and still very unique to the Ukrainian context is the fact that citizens kind of took the state's monopoly over the use of violence, and also the fact that civil society groups helped the armed actors or the army or volunteer battalions by arming them, by providing them with equipment, with food, with clothing. It's something kind of unusual for other contexts. And in that sense, that mobilization was also spontaneous. But the question is how sustainable it is. And we see, and this studies in our book show also that many of these groups, they were very active and strong in the first years after the Euromaidan, the first years after the protests, when also the armed conflict was very, let's say, active and there were hostilities going on. And then as hostilities kind of calmed down a bit, many of these groups either disappeared and many activists basically stopped doing what they were doing. And very few groups persisted and kind of sustained and developed their activity, their civic activism in something more sustainable, and they developed some kind of structures to continue. And there's one very interesting chapter that shows the sustainability and what groups have to do in order to become sustainable, showing how the group that appeared during the Euromaidan groups, that ICT groups, the group that used basically digital technologies in order to share the message around Ukraine and around the world about the protests and what the protests were about, how few of them actually converted in some kind of more stable organizational forms. And they, of course, had to rethink completely their structures and their survival strategies. Because before, during the protests, when there were mass mobilization, they can draw on participation of many volunteers and members who would provide main services of these groups. But then when the mass mobilization also calmed down, they had to reinvent themselves basically and to think what are they going to do. And their structures also have changed, and their surviving strategies have changed. They had to find new funders, and many of them also turned to foreign donors in order to keep doing what they wanted to do. Yes, they have. I mean, they have to become professionalized, because before they were just, active citizens. They were spontaneously thinking, "What can we do?" And they were inventing. They were very creative, and they were inventing things that they have to do and methods as the protest developed, and then when the conflict started. But after a while, they also realized that that support to their causes diminished a bit. And they also have to reinvent themselves in a way and also structure their work so they can be sustainable. And in that sense, these groups become smaller, but more professionalized. I would say that the main difference is before they were very reactive. They reacted to events that happened. And once you have, you need to think of sustainability, you also need to think of strategy. Why do you exist? And this is what one of the questions that these groups and civic activists ask themselves. What is our strategy? What do we want to do? Where do we want to see ourselves in a year from now, in 2 years from now? And then this is the question also tied to resources. Where do we find resources to sustain what we want to do in a year from now? And this chapter in particular shows that these groups had to reduce their staff. But they also not only they kind of had to reduce the number of people they cooperate with and they engage with, but they become professional staff, people who are paid for what they're doing, or at least halfly paid for what they're doing, and people who also develop certain professional skills and can relate with other actors, other society groups or donors or the state. Yeah, it's this chapter basically is a kind of a mapping study of Ukrainian think tanks, and it also looks at strategies of a think tank, how to survive. And basically the main conclusion of the chapter is think tanks had also, they existed for many years, for 20 years. Most of them were foreign funded. Some of them were established by some kind of foreign foundations or philanthropic foundations. And to a large extent, they were, because of, the resources and the fact that they had to work with foreign donors, also they were not very much involved with citizens or citizens groups. And this has changed a bit after the Euromaidan, in the sense that they became more open, started to publish more, tried to engage with citizens, also using social networks and so on. But they still couldn't change much the composition of the revenues. They still had to rely to a large extent on foreign donors, because in Ukraine, neither citizens nor the state appreciate the work of think tanks enough that they can pay for the services, either by donations or by as a state through grants or service procurement. I think even after, because this book was a sequel of Kyiv-Mohyla Law and Politics Journal special issue on Euromaidan, which also some of the authors contributed to the book as well. But still, after doing these two research projects on civil society in post-Euromaidan Ukraine, I was surprised how little we know about civil society. And there are many, unfortunately, even with this book with 12 chapters, there are still many areas that are uncovered. Like, for example, diaspora networks and their participation in the protests, and also what happened afterwards. And how this new and old diaspora and groups in Ukraine cooperated, how they transferred, the ideas and resources and activism. I think it's something very fascinating, and it should be investigated into deeper. There are some articles, but not enough. Or grassroots networks. There is a bit of it in the book when two authors write about volunteer groups, but still, this volunteer group, they help big causes, either the displaced or the army, or they try to incorporate themselves in the Ministry of Defense and change the ministry and procurement process from within. But there are many grassroots groups that work at very local level in Ukraine, in villages and towns. And Euromaidan also gave a boost to them to become more visible, more organized, come together and try to work with local authorities or with other actors like businesses and so on. And there are many of them, but they're very invisible, because usually the media attention do not turn to them. And it's very difficult also for foreign donors who usually commission such studies on civil society in Ukraine to notice them, because they're self-organized, they're very small, they're informal, sometimes they're not registered at all as civil society organizations. So to a large extent, they're invisible, but there are many things going on with their participation at the local level, and they're really trying to change the quality of local politics and public policy making. And I think, there should be more studies focusing on them as well. The same, there are some articles written on, let's say, radical right actors. There are fewer on radical left, but we also know very little on, let's say, less the group that would not call themselves liberal society groups, and their civic activism, their methods, and the radical right actors became more visible now after the Euromaidan protest, and then certainly more visible in the Ukrainian media. But we still know very little about their structures, how they recruit members, how they finance themselves. What are their long-term strategies, how they see themselves. They say that their business is street politics, but still some of these groups are represented in the parliament or try to run in local elections. And we know little how they see this balance between street politics and parliamentary politics or local level politics. So what surprised me is, despite that so many, this book represents such a richness and diversity of civil society in Ukraine, there are still many areas that are undercovered. I think it's the other way around. The fact that social trust increased also made possible these organizations to function. In the book, there are several chapters that point to the sources of income of volunteer groups. They raise donations of many individuals. Sometimes they raise millions, but these millions come from thousands, if not hundreds of thousands individuals. And it was possible only because people kind of trusted these totally strangers, unknown people, but they trusted that they collect money for the good and they will use it with a benefit for the public good. And because of this increased social trust in each other, let's say, in strangers, this kind of volunteerism and civic activism was possible. The question is what to do when there is no such strong factor of civil society mobilization as the armed conflict or any kind of conflict, and how these groups can also endure and become sustainable in keeping the social trust and also generating more of it. And now there are many groups who think how to become less dependent on foreign donors and get more resources internally, either from businesses or from local governments or from people, how to raise individual donations. It's a big issue still for the society in Ukraine, how to become less dependent on foreign donors. And very few groups are totally independent. And the groups that are really professional and sustainable, I'm not talking about small kind of grassroots civic activism. And I think here the issue of trust is key. But on the positive side, I would also say that public opinion polls show that among all public institutions, society actors, especially volunteer groups, are the most trusted. And I think it's very important for civil society in Ukraine and for those groups to use this trust, also to introduce some maybe code of conduct or code of ethical conduct, let's say, that all society groups share, because now there are so many groups active that it's often society activist is also a term that is frequently misused, because anyone can call themselves civil society activist, but there should be one kind of standard of behavior or code of ethics that all civil society actors share. And I think it's something that is top on the agenda now. The civil society groups feel that some of them suffer because some groups that have nothing to do with civil society but call themselves civil society conduct some nefarious business or sometimes even illegal business. And it's very important to introduce some internal norms, internal standards, how we do regulate ourselves, and standards of self-regulation for civil society in Ukraine, to keep this trust in civil society and to be able to generate more from it, to be able to engage citizens, to participate in civil society organizations, to donate to civil society organizations, to relate to them, to be part of their causes. I think there are many successes. I wouldn't point to any one type of organization. For example, the chapter on churches shows how churches become socially active And they become not just religious institutions where people with that share a common religion and common religion views come and participate in religious practices, but how they become relevant to the society at large, even to those non-goers or non-believers. And it's very interesting chapter that shows how the social activism of churches made them extremely relevant and even more powerful within the society. But I think there are many successes, not only the case of churches, but also LGBT groups. They became more vocal, or groups defending human rights. They also, some of them managed to liaise with citizens, to engage them more to their work, not just publish some reports and presenting them at the international forum, but also work domestically, engage people in their work, help people to consult them how to access justice, for example, or how to access their rights. And I think, the Euromaidan was an important factor in pushing different kinds of civil society groups to go and work with people, to engage citizens, to try to get them involved, to raise the nations, and so on. But I think this work should be continued all the time. It's not something that you do once and that's it. It's very important for all these groups to keep doing that, and some groups are better in doing that, others not so good. But I think it's like a live population. It's inevitable that some groups will disappear and others will flourish. And the idea of this book comes also with this, as a continuation of the Kyiv-Mohyla Law and Politics Journal special issue on civil society in Ukraine. This special issue was published exactly a year ago, in December 2017. And for that, we basically, I was a co-editor, Olga Burluk was a co-editor, and Katerina Zarembo, who now is an author of one of the chapters of the book, was a co-editor. And our idea was to examine what is going on in civil society in Ukraine after the Euromaidan, and we basically published an open call for proposals. And we received, I think, up to 30 proposals for articles, and then we invited about, I think, 10 authors or teams of authors to contribute, and this journal was published. And after it was published, we thought that so many areas were uncovered, and we wanted to bring even more. We just realized that we touched the ground and saw how rich it was, and we know very little about it. So we decided to continue with this book as a book project, invite more authors, and we also try to invite those authors who are specialists in some fields that we thought are important but were not covered by the special issue. For example, there was nothing on religious institutions and churches, and we were looking for authors who could do that. Or we wanted to have a chapter examining civil society impact on reforms, and we found authors who wrote about reanimation reform coalition, and they wrote a chapter on how organized civil society advocated for reforms and what successes they achieved in this process. It was first it was an open call for proposals, but then we were also looking for some specialists in specific fields that we thought they were uncovered. Okay, this book doesn't have a chapter called Conclusions, and this is on purpose because I think we felt that there is nothing to conclude on because the process is indeed ongoing. But we tried, in an introductory chapter, we tried to show common patterns, what we see is developing in Ukraine. And some of them, actually, they're not only, they don't belong only to the Ukrainian context, but it's something that is going on worldwide, that much of civic activism is less formal, more fluid, more horizontal. Many groups do not function as they used to function before. There are still NGOs that are professional, that do advocacy at the policy level, at the national level, but there are many more groups that are active at very specific fields or at the very local level, and they're organized in very different ways. They don't have paid staff sometimes, they don't have rigid structures. They attract volunteers, and there is a core membership, and then there are other supporters with whom they work on some occasions, or where there are some events, important events. And I think this is something that is going on not only in Ukraine but worldwide, that civic activism is less formal, more horizontal, more fluid, and there are also many more new tactics that civic activists use. And this is one kind of pattern that we also saw in the book across all these different chapters. Another is about diversity of civil society actors, and that not all of them are necessarily liberal or pursue or defend human rights and democracy. Some of them are not liberal, but they're still part of this active citizenship and organized society, and they organize themselves, they defend the rights of their members, of the rights of their constituencies, how they see. And in that sense, we also saw that civil society as a space is a space of contestation of the different ideas and values and strategies. And several chapters show how different groups with different values and ideologies actually clash in the same field, how they defend antagonistic views or values, and sometimes there are also instances of physical violence between them. Not only, some kind of verbal discussions of what to do. And we also, we pointed to this fact because we wanted to show that civil society is not something necessarily good. It can be very ambivalent for democracy, because some civic groups can defend values that exclude others. Exclude minorities, for example, or exclude many rights for citizens. And this is what was one of the patterns that we saw also in the book. And finally, we also, because we tried to show the changes and we focused on them on purpose, the changes that happened with civil society in Ukraine after the Euromaidan, we also wanted to show that there is certain continuity and there is certain inertia. And in that sense, for example, the dependency of organized civil society on foreign donors is something that hasn't been overcome since the Euromaidan. It's still a trend, and it's still, the problem with it is not that civil society groups are funded by some philanthropic foundation or foreign governments, but the fact that by being funded by someone external, they're also less motivated to work with citizens and to engage them, because their sources of support do not depend on them. And in that sense, it's a still challenge for many groups, for example, human rights groups, how to balance between the work with citizens and engaging them in human rights work and making them human rights defenders, and then knowing that there will be certain types of work that citizens were not able to pay for or donate for, and they still have to raise funds with foreign donors and maybe pursue some foreign donors' agendas. And it's still kind of a challenge for many groups how to become less dependent on foreign sources of support, and how to mobilize internal sources of support, either from local governments or from local businesses or from citizens or residents of or communities. I feel encouraged to continue researching civil society in Ukraine, and also comparing it to developments that happen in other contexts, in post-conflict contexts, in other post-Soviet countries, in countries that integrate with Europe, and to see what are the common trends, and to study also these transnational links between civil society groups and how the ideas and resources and people, activists travel across the borders. And I also think it's also important to produce these studies, because they should be some kind of reflection within civil society sector in Ukraine, and also among state actors that cooperate with civil society, how to organize this work, how society should cooperate with the state. And for example, this book raises an issue of state substitution, whether civil society should substitute the state to make it stronger, or whether state substitution actually makes the state weaker. And I think it's one of the questions that civil society actors still ask themselves in Ukraine, and it should be more informed, more well-researched debate on that, whether society should take some functions of the state and continue performing them years since the conflict started, when there is no more emergency anymore, or whether should say, stop, we won't do it, because otherwise we weaken the foundations of the state, and we take the function that the state should be doing. I think there should be more debate in civil society, within the civil society, and among researchers on that. The same is with the issue of diversity. What to do with it? What to do with the fact that some civic actors use violence, whether we accept it or not? What would be the stance of civil society toward that? What to do? And I think there are many issues that come from this book that need further questions and further answers. I think, I mean, maybe one sentence that I would like to add, because we were also trying to contribute to the debate, academic debate on civil society, and much of this debate focused on whether post-communist and post-Soviet civil societies are strong or weak. And the argument in this debate comes as that because people do not participate much in civil society organizations, the participation levels, membership levels are low, civil society are weak, inherently weak in post-Soviet, post-communist context. And there are also a lot of reliance on informal networks of citizens in order to kind of deal and solve some public policy issues. And we wanted to go beyond this argument, saying that it's not all about necessarily measuring membership levels or participation levels, because nowadays civic activism is much more fluid, less formal. You don't need to establish a formal NGO and have membership fees in order to kind of be part of civil society. Many activists, they just have some blogs on social media, or they attend public or community meetings, and and they belong to many groups at the same time without being formal member in either of them. And with this book, we also wanted kind of to shift this debate from this argument whether post-Soviet and post-communist civil societies are weak or strong, and encourage researchers to go deeper and examine these groups in more detail, to kind of submerge into and closely look at some groups to show what they're doing exactly, how they change in their tactics, their strategies, how they work with citizens, how they're organized internally, how they deal with the state and interact with the state and other actors. And I think the idea of this book to show this richness of civil society and what civil society is and the concept of civil society. I'm with Carnegie Civic Research Network, and this is a network of, I think we are now 10 scholars from different parts of the world, like Brazil, India, Uganda, Thailand, Tunis, and we research civic activism in our respective countries. I represent Ukraine, so I'm constantly writing something on civic activism in Ukraine on different aspects. And that's why I'm kind of, this topic is something that I follow on. Recently we published a report on conservative civil society, and it was a very interesting report because it shows that in all these countries that we covered, there are, I think, 8 case studies, like Georgia, Poland, Brazil, Thailand, Turkey, Ukraine, and in all these countries there is a rise of conservative civil society groups that, for many organizations that are liberal civil society organizations, or many donors that support liberal civil society organizations, and these groups are kind of terra incognita. They know very little about them, but in many countries, like in Brazil, these groups are on the rise, and they change even party politics and country politics. And it was interesting to see how kind of the same narratives, in a way, were shared by groups in very different countries with very different contexts. The narratives of kind of preserving national identity, keeping traditional, what is called traditional family values, or opposing what they saw as kind of invasion of liberal discourses coming from Western countries and so on. These narratives were common for very different countries. And there is a chapter in the book, the first chapter in the book, called How Open is Civic Space in Ukraine. And I think this issue of civic space is key to understand whether such protests are possible. And I would say that throughout the history of independent Ukraine, civic space in Ukraine was quite open. I mean, there were moments of repression, of kind of backlash, state backlash against civil society and civic freedoms. But in general, I think in Ukraine, throughout these years, people could take the streets, could mobilize, could protest. Yeah, some of them would be beaten or were arrested or put even in jail, but still, I mean, people felt that they could exercise this right. And I think the very fact that state in 2013, state tried to take this right back from them, even mobilized more people. People were not afraid to face some physical violence or some repressions, because they really felt that they have to defend this right, because it's fundamental to many other rights that they can enjoy in the country, including having free and fair elections. And I think in Russia, unfortunately, civic space is much more closed, and it closed for many, many years. It was open a bit in 90s, but then, I mean, starting from 2000, already for almost 20 years, it's kind of was closing, shrinking, and in such civic space where it's very difficult to express one's opinion freely, publicly, to have a peaceful assembly, to present dissenting views. It's very difficult also to expect, people, masses of people going together without fear and protesting. I mean, they're still protesting in Russia. In many places in Russia, they're sporadic, but unfortunately, we haven't seen any protest that would be so strong that the state would not crush them. Thank you very much for inviting. It was a pleasure speaking about the book and about the subject of the book, civil society in Ukraine. I think it's something fascinating to research and to watch, and I also feel that there is much hope coming from civil society in Ukraine, despite the fact that the state of affairs in the country is maybe not so hopeful. There's not so many achievements that we would like to see 5 years since the Euromaidan protests, but I think if there is a hope, it comes from civil society. Я недавно почала працювати з ООН. Я живу в Краматорську, більшість часу, але приїжджаю в Харків майже на вихідні, бо я сама з Харкова. До побачення, дуже приємно, дуже дякую.